Welcome back to this lecture series for ethics. In this video we'll continue our discussion of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, and specifically we're going to do so by again focusing on his hedonism, and in this video really looking at one prominent objection to hedonism. But first let's recap what the idea of hedonism is and how it plays a role in the overall utilitarian theory. Hedonism is just the view that pleasure is the sole intrinsic value. It's the only thing that's valued in itself. It's the only thing that's valued as an end. There are many other good things like going to the doctor, going to school, cars, and trees. These are all good things, but only insofar as they're instruments or they produce pleasure. And of course this plays a role in Mill's utilitarian theory because he says, well, what determines whether an action is good or bad is the consequence. How do we know if the consequence of an action is good? Does that consequence involve pleasure in the absence of pain, or does it not? To the extent that our actions produce pleasure and allow us to avoid pain, not just for us as we'll see, but also for all humanity, for everyone our action can affect, insofar as they do that, they are good actions. So again, in this video, I want to look at a prominent objection to Mill's utilitarianism, and in fact we're going to see it's one that Mill himself considered. So after he's explained that pleasure in the absence of pain is the only intrinsic good, he then considers the following criticism of his theory. Mill tells us, now such a theory of life excites in many minds inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine. Now this point I think could certainly be echoed by Aristotle and Aquinas. Both of those thinkers emphasize the way in which human beings are somewhat special, in which yes, we can experience pleasure, yes, pleasure is a good thing, but other animals experience pleasure too, so whatever our ultimate good is, it can't be something we share with other animals. And here Mill's essentially posing this objection. If you're going to say that the only good in a human life is pleasure in the absence of pain, doesn't that degrade human nature? Isn't there a sense in which that brings us down a level? Isn't human life more noble than that? And if you also think just about the colloquial meaning of hedonism, usually when you think of, not in a philosophical context, but just in a normal, everyday context, the idea of hedonism is just immediate pleasure-seeking, drinking as much as you can, having sex as much as you can, just enjoying the bodily pleasures to an extremely intemperate amount. And so you might think, well, how can Mill tell us that this is all human life really is? Isn't there anything more to human life? Now, as we're going to see, Mill in fact does think that there is more to human life than just sort of simple pleasure seeking. But to put a stronger point on this objection, I want to do so by using the following example that was posed by a philosopher named Fred Feldman. And I'm going to call this case Porky. Now the reason it's called Porky, it's picking up on this idea from that passage from Mill that hedonism is a doctrine worthy only of swine. So here is the case or the example that Feldman has us imagine. Imagine a person, we can call him Porky, who spends all his time in the pigsty, engaging in the most obscene sexual activities imaginable. Let's imagine that Porky happily carries on like this for many years. Also imagine that Porky has no human friends, no other sources of pleasure, and no interesting knowledge. And of course I have a picture here. We'll imagine that this is Porky, and it's important to think about what you're imagining in this scenario is not a pig living in the way pigs do in the pigsty. No, what you're imagining in this scenario is a human being, for whatever reason, who finds great enjoyment in living the life of a pig. Rolling around the pigsty, eating slop, right? Doing all the sorts of things that pigs do. Now, you might say, well, what is the point of this example? How does it relate to what we're talking about? Well, we can use this example to make what I'll call the swine objection argument against hedonism. So here's how the argument goes. P1, if hedonism is true, then Porky's life is going well for him. Okay, so why would that be the case? Well, if hedonism is true, the only thing that is truly valuable is pleasure in the absence of pain. We're also told that Porky's life is entirely pleasurable. He feels no discontent. Porky enjoys rolling around in the pigsty, despite the fact that he's not pursuing any interesting knowledge or enjoying beauty or enjoying substantial human friendships or other difficult accomplishments. Despite all that, Porky feels great. He enjoys his life. He loves what he's doing. So P1 holds, well, it seems like if all that really matters is pleasure, then yeah, Porky's life is going well. P2. However, Porky's life is not going well for him, the claim is. Therefore, hedonism is not true. Now, I want to focus on the second premise for a moment. Because one reaction you might have to this argument is that just the second premise isn't correct. You might say, yeah, you know what? If hedonism is true, then Porky's life is going well for him, and guess what? Porky's life is going great for him. That's someone who has things figured out. Right? Porky isn't going around worrying about the exam that they have to take. Porky doesn't have to worry about how they're doing at their job. They don't have to worry about raising children, or really any responsibility at all. Porky has his desires and needs sort of very tightly circumscribed just to refer to his immediate environment and the immediate pleasures he can enjoy. Doesn't want anything else outside of that, and so is completely content. So on the one hand, if you look at Porky and you say, yeah, Porky's got it figured out, I wish, I could live a life like that. I wish I didn't have the responsibilities of an adult human being. If that's your reaction, then I suppose this argument won't do much for you. You won't see it as really a strong objection to hedonism. On the other hand, though, those who would make this argument think that that's not the right attitude to take toward Porky. Right? And the way I think about it is, ask yourself the following question. When you think about Porky, when you think about a human being living that life, do you have a sense of pity or jealousy? Are you jealous? Do you wish you could live that life? Or do you look at Porky and have a sense of sort of sadness, of pity? Do you sort of look down upon Porky and say, he's missing out on a whole swath of experience, out of a wonderful, diverse range of experiences that he'll never be able to know? The experience of human love, the experience of experiencing beauty through works of art, of solving a very difficult math problem, of achieving something very difficult in the athletic arena. Do you look at Porky and say, he's missing out on all these experiences, there's so much more he could be enjoying, but he just isn't? And if you do have that sort of sense, if you look at Porky and you feel a sense of sadness or pity, you feel bad for Porky, then you might say, well, maybe there's something to this argument. Maybe Porky's life isn't going well for him. And if Porky's life isn't going well for him, then maybe we should agree with Aristotle and Aquinas that in fact there's something beyond mere pleasure. That pleasure in itself doesn't encapsulate a full human life. In fact, we need something more. So again, the basic argument just is that hedonism can't be true because Porky's life isn't the best life for a human being. There's more for a human being. And if Porky's life isn't the best for a human being, there must be something beyond pleasure. Hedonism just can't be the right account of human well-being. That's the argument. Now, of course, Mill is a hedonist. He sees hedonism as a foundation of his utilitarian moral theory. So we might wonder, and he posed this objection, so we might wonder what is his response. Now, interestingly, Mill he agrees with P2 of this argument. Mill agrees that Porky's life is not going well for him, or at least it's not going nearly as well as it could be, or he might expect that it would go. Instead, the premise he takes aim at is premise 1. What Mill is going to argue is not that Porky has a great life, he's just going to argue that there's nothing about hedonism. There's nothing about the idea that all human good reduces down to pleasure in the absence of pain. There's nothing in that implies that the life we should live is just a life of simple and immediate and pleasure-seeking and satisfaction. So he makes this point in the following passage. He says, when hedonists are attacked, they've always answered, it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light. Since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. So Mill reverses the tables here. He says, look, if you're saying that hedonism degrades human nature, That just means you're not really recognizing all the sorts of pleasures that human beings are capable of enjoying. And that, while yes, we can enjoy very simple bodily pleasures of eating and drinking and sleeping and sex, we can enjoy all those. There's also a large amount of pleasures out there, a whole nother world of pleasures that simply aren't open to other animals, and which Porky is depriving himself of. And the way he puts it here is, a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. And to further make this point, he draws this famous distinction between what he calls higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Now, what is this distinction? Well, so he says there are certain sorts of pleasures which he encapsulates and gives examples of as pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments, which have a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. So, how do we think about this? Well, there's some lower pleasures which are of a lower quality. And what are these lower pleasures? They're the sorts of pleasures of sensation which we share with other animals. Again, eating, sleeping, drinking, sex, all those sorts of things, which a pig can do, which many other animals can do. And he's not saying, again, that those don't play any role in a good life, but they're not fundamentally the sorts of pleasures that give us a true and fulfilling human happiness. He says, as opposed to these, there's a sort of higher pleasures. And what are these higher pleasures? He says the pleasures of the intellect, the pleasures of feeling and imagination, of the moral sentiments. Well, what does this mean? The pleasures of the intellect. Think about the pleasure of learning something new, of solving a difficult math problem, of understanding a difficult work of literature, of understanding a difficult philosophical concept for that matter. In all these experiences, there's a certain amount of hard work, of frustration, there's a higher probability that you won't succeed, and then yet think about the experience when you do succeed, when you do come to that moment of understanding. That's a certain sort of pleasure of the intellect which we human beings can experience only because we have higher mental capacities. What about the pleasures of our feelings and imagination? Think about the pleasure we get from taking pride in an accomplishment. Think about the pleasure of love and affection. Think about the pleasures of the imagination, the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person, consider things from their point of view, and sympathize or celebrate with them the great things that happen to them. Think about your ability to put yourself in the shoes of a character in a work of literature and see things through their eyes and engage in a deeper way with fantasy. And then finally, the pleasures of the moral sentiments. As we discussed very early on in this course with the comments made by David Hume, there's a certain sort of pleasure that comes from doing the right thing. And it's a pleasure that just simply isn't available to other animals. Because you might say, look, a dog or a cat, the animals we often keep as pets, we might praise them for doing the right thing, for following our rules, for acting in a sort of peaceable and well-behaved manner. We might praise them for doing those things. But animals don't have the same sort of consciousness of being virtuous, of being morally good, of having played their part in society, of having helped other people. There's a certain sort of pleasure that comes from doing the right thing that only human beings can enjoy. So Mill's first point is that Porky's life is, it's sort of a lower grade of existence. It's a deprived life precisely because he has deprived himself of the opportunity to enjoy these higher pleasures. And later on in chapter 2, I think Mill gives another helpful way of thinking about this distinction. He says, a happy human life is a life with a decided prominence of active pleasure over passive pleasure. So another way to think about the higher pleasures is they require the active involvement of our intellect, the active involvement of our feelings, of our motivations, and our moral sentiments. Whereas the lower pleasures can be passive. How difficult is it to sit on the couch and watch as Netflix goes from one show to the next and the next and the next and just binge on Netflix? Can it be enjoyable? Can it be a nice escape? Sure, but it's entirely passive activity. And it just seems it would be a very deprived sort of human life if, just like Porky, if all you did was sit in the basement and watch Netflix and binge on that as it fed you one show after another after another. But then compare that to sort of the active pleasures of athletic accomplishment, artistic achievement, moral greatness. These are all active pleasures which demand something from us, which are difficult, but give us a sense of satisfaction and pleasure in the end, which simply can't be matched by the more simple enjoyments that the lower animals are capable of. And one philosopher, Benjamin Gibbs, describes these active higher pleasures as the following: activities and enterprises which require hard work, close attention, and perseverance. These activities do not soothe our feelings, they don't coddle our bodily appetites. They offer no enticement to the weary, the indolent, the dissolute, or the frivolous, yet they can be highly enjoyable, interesting, stimulating, engrossing, and fascinating, or in some such way intrinsically rewarding, just because of the demands they make on our character and skill. Just think of your own life, something for which you find to be extremely enjoyable, very pleasurable, but also in a real way quite frustrating. That's the sort of thing that Mill has in mind. And it might be different for different people. There are a wide variety of higher pleasures. So you might find, athletic achievement more pleasurable than someone who finds poetry more pleasurable, than someone who finds math more pleasurable. But what all these things have in common is they make a real demand on you and your character and your intellect and your will to overcome difficult obstacles, to overcome frustration, to work hard and do things that are difficult. So what Mill is saying is the reason hedonism doesn't degrade human nature is because there are enjoyments human beings are capable of that call on everything that we have, that call on our entire being. So just like Aristotle and Aquinas, Mill thinks he can explain why the good life is a life that elevates human beings. By no means does Mill see himself as advocating for a simple hedonistic pleasure-seeking lifestyle where we just passively eat and drink and sleep into sort of a stupor. In fact, he's advocating just the opposite. So now that we have this distinction between the higher pleasures and the lower pleasures, we might ask, well, how do we know what is a higher pleasure and what is a lower pleasure? Mill at one point tells us that the higher pleasures, the reason they're better is because they give us a greater quality of pleasure. And this means that there's a difference in kind between them, such that no amount of the lower pleasures could fundamentally equal a higher pleasure. So take an example of a higher pleasure, learning how to solve a very difficult math problem. What Mill is saying is when you finally accomplish that task, you bring all your intellect and ability to bear, and you accomplish that task, that pleasure you get is of such a high quality, such a greater kind of pleasure, that no amount of just watching Netflix, no amount of just eating and drinking could ever equal that experience. And perhaps that's right. But we might wonder, how does Mill know that these the things he says are higher pleasures are actually of a greater quality? Why do we think that the moral pleasures, the pleasures of the feelings and imagination, and the pleasures of the intellect, how do we know these are a greater quality? Well, on this point, Mill puts forth what he calls his preference test. And the idea here is it's a test to determine, for any pleasure we can think of, is it a higher or lower one? Is it the sort of pleasure which we can say has a greater quality that distinguishes it from the lower ones? And it really has three parts. So the first thing he says is, if you take two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience in both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So this first one I'm going to call the preference of competent judges. So the idea is that if you have two pleasures, and you ask everyone who is competent to judge these pleasures, and what does that mean? Just anyone who's tried both. So if you're comparing solving a difficult math problem to watching Netflix, and if you ask anyone who has truly experienced both of those, and everyone or almost everyone gives their preference to one of those, then that's the first condition, the first thing that indicates it's the higher pleasure. So the first thing that Mill thinks is that if you truly ask someone who had spent their time doing something intellectually difficult and succeeded, and had also spent their time just passively watching Netflix or eating or drinking, they might say that the passive pleasures were enjoyable and had a certain enjoyment to them, but everyone or almost everyone would agree that the intellectual pleasure was superior. Okay, so that's the first thing, the preference of these competent judges who have tried both. The second thing he tells us as part of this test is this: if one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent. So, this is a crucial point. What Mill is also saying, and I'll call this the acceptance of discontent, is that for the higher pleasures, the competent judges will prefer them even though they cause frustration, even though they're difficult, even though they cause some dissatisfaction, even though they make us discontent. Because think about trying to solve a difficult math problem, trying to create a beautiful work of art, trying to establish a loving and deep and substantial relationship with a friend. Think about all the trials and tribulations, all the failures you have to go through to ultimately do those things. Mill's point is that if we're really dealing with a higher pleasure, then those competent judges would accept that failure. They would accept those difficulties and the dissatisfaction along the way as just a price you have to pay for the ultimately more satisfying, the greater satisfaction you get, the greater pleasure you feel when you finally succeed in that endeavor. So for the higher pleasures, we're willing to put up with a greater amount of difficulty, with greater dissatisfaction. And finally, the third part of the preference test, he says these competent judges, they would not resign the higher pleasure, for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of. And I'll call this sort of the non-comparability condition. So the idea is that these competent judges, not only do they say that the higher pleasure is better, not only are they willing to accept more suffering and discontent to achieve it, but there is no amount of the lower pleasure you could offer them that would make them just give up on their ability to feel that higher pleasure. So let's say you're talking to someone who has successfully solved a very difficult math problem, and they've experienced that pleasure and all the dissatisfaction and the difficulty that they had to feel in order to do that. And then he said, look, I know you have this ability to do very difficult and complex math problems. Would you want to just give that away for an unlimited supply of immediate sensual pleasure? And when I say that Mill thinks the higher pleasures are a greater kind or type of pleasure, this is what he means. If it's really a higher pleasure, we would say, look, I would not want to give up this ability I have to solve these difficult math problems, to create a beautiful work of art, to reach the heights of athletic achievement, to establish a truly profound relationship with a significant other or a friend. I wouldn't give all that up for any amount of just the simple ability to drink or eat or sleep or have sex as much as I want. In comparison to the higher pleasures, all those immediate bodily sensual pleasures just will feel empty. And again, not that you can never pursue them, but they wouldn't be valuable enough that you would actually get rid of your higher capabilities. And as we're going to see, with these points in place, we get to some of the most famous passages from Chapter 2 of Utilitarianism, where he invites us to reflect on the following question. Are you happy that you are the way you are? Are you happy that you're a human being with higher intellectual capacities in the ability to experience higher pleasures? And based on all the things he said about the preference test, it makes sense that we should be happy. And here's the way he puts it. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for the promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human would consent to be a fool. No instructed person in ignoramus. No pure person of feeling and conscience would want to be selfish and base. Even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. So what's the point he's making? He's saying you would not want to be Porky, even if you thought Porky was more satisfied than you are. You wouldn't want to be someone who is morally corrupt, even if you thought the morally corrupt person was more satisfied. You wouldn't want to be someone who didn't have the higher level thinking capability that you have. You wouldn't want to live the rest of your life as a very small child, for instance, even if you think the child's life is so much easier, so much more simple, and has so much more satisfaction. And he thinks, we are willing to accept our lot as human beings capable of pursuing the higher pleasures, even though we know pursuing these pleasures causes us more suffering and difficulty. He says the being of higher pleasures requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, but in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. Mill thinks you wouldn't want to become Porky, you wouldn't want to become an actual pig, you wouldn't want to become a child, you wouldn't want to become a psychopath, because none of those individuals are capable of experiencing very fundamental higher pleasures that make us who we are. Now, in order to evaluate that claim, it really is important to understand what you're giving up. Because Mill says whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness confounds two very different ideas, happiness and content or satisfaction. When Mill says that the life of higher pleasures is better, he's not necessarily saying it's a more satisfied life. He's saying it's a happier life. And we can think about this in a number of ways. So, compare two groups, beings of higher faculties and lower faculties. Compare yourself to Porky. Porky, Mill would say, is very content. Why? He's very satisfied. Everything he wants is right there. He wants to roll around the mud, he can roll around the mud. He wants to eat slop, he can eat slop. Everything is right there for him. Think about a child who is protected, well-fed, and well taken care of. Everything a child wants is immediately there. They want food, they get food. They need clothes, clothes are provided by their parents. They don't have to go out and get a job. They don't have to do any of those things. You can imagine an entirely content and satisfied child. But what Mill is going to say is that the process we've all undergone of growing up, of having to take on more responsibility, of gaining our higher intellectual faculties, that process is a process whereby we are less satisfied but more happy. Because think about what happens as you gain these higher intellectual capacities. As you gain these higher intellectual capacities, you have the ability to think for yourself. You have the ability to engage in more complex tasks. And with the ability to engage in more complex, more demanding tasks, although there is a greater possibility of payoff, greater possibility of happiness and pleasure, there's also a greater possibility of failure. You know, I keep talking about the person who solved the difficult math problem and was very satisfied afterward, but what about the person who fails? What about the person who never achieves their goal? So being a more developed being, Mill says, gives us a possibility for greater happiness, but we have to give up that easy contentment and satisfaction. And in part, you can think about just in terms of philosophy. I would say personally, philosophy has made me extremely happy. It is what Mill would call a principal ingredient of my happiness. I can't imagine myself being wholly living a pleasurable life, living a happy life, without the ability to think philosophically. At the same time, it hasn't made me content, it hasn't made me satisfied. The more I think about philosophical questions, the more I question my own beliefs. The more I want to know, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. So there's this sort of inverse relationship here. Beings of higher faculties can be happier, but also less satisfied. Beings of lower faculties can be more satisfied, but less happy. And Mill thinks this is worth it. We should be happy that we are as we are, even if we can't be as satisfied. And to further consider this, another famous passage from chapter 2 is the following. Mill says, it's better to be a human being satisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So he makes this comparison here between Socrates, a famous philosopher, who in fact was the teacher of Aristotle, and who was the character in the dialogue that Plato wrote, the Republic, that we looked at very early in the course. Now, I want to think about this comparison between Socrates and Porky. So if you think about these two individuals, Socrates was famous for the following statement. Socrates said in one of his famous works, The Apology, the unexamined life isn't worth living for a human being. What did it mean to examine your life, to think critically about your beliefs, to engage in philosophy, to engage in philosophical discussion? And Socrates said for a human being, it wouldn't be worth living your life if you couldn't engage in that activity. If you simply accepted the beliefs of your community or what you commonly grew up with, or if you just sort of accept the beliefs that make you feel good, that already confirm what you already believe, you don't truly examine your beliefs and examine how you're living and examine what's important in life, then it's not just you're living a bad life, you're just not living a life that's befitting of a human being. Compare that to Porky. So Socrates has these, sort of high-minded ideals of living an examined life. What does Porky say? Today I rolled it around in the mud. And that's what Porky does every day. And whereas Porky is completely satisfied, Socrates is fundamentally dissatisfied. Socrates engages in this philosophical examination of his own beliefs, and what he finds is that he knows nothing of what he truly wants to know. He wants to know how to live a good life, how to live virtuously, and Socrates says, the only thing I've really found out is that I have the humility to admit that I don't actually know the answers to these fundamental questions. So Socrates very much dissatisfied, Porky very much satisfied, but Mill would say Socrates is happier, Socrates is living better. Because Socrates is living a more human life. Socrates is enjoying the higher pleasure of engaging in philosophical dialogue and philosophical inquiry. And that just is the point Mill is making. There's nothing about hedonism that degrades human nature, because human nature is capable of so many more pleasures beyond the simple pleasures of the animal, the child, or even the person who's morally corrupt and doesn't understand the pleasure of virtue. So while I think Mill makes a compelling case for why we would not want to voluntarily degrade ourselves to a lower grade of existence, I think there are moments where, if we're honest with ourselves, if we think about the responsibilities of our adult lives, if we think about the dissatisfaction which comes with having to think through problems for ourselves, if we think of the real possibility of failure when we try to achieve something significant, there can seem to be something appealing about the life of Porky or a child or just a non-human animal which lets its instincts guide it for how it ought to live. I'll admit that there can seem something appealing about that. So you might wonder, what are some further reasons? Why should we think our happiness is so tied up with these higher faculties of ours? And in the following passage, Mill gives a number of these reasons. So one he says is pride. Right? There's something about being able to take sort of pride or ownership of your accomplishments which requires pursuit of the higher pleasures. And I think we can think back to Aristotle here and his idea about greatness of soul. Remember, the person with greatness of soul accomplishes great things and understands their worth and understands that they deserve honor for great things. Could we ever have that sort of pride, that sort of sense of self, that sort of view of ourselves if we simply limited ourselves to passive, simple, bodily, sensual pleasures? Seems unlikely. Mill also notes the love of liberty and personal independence, which he says is related to the Stoics. The Stoics wanted to sort of steel us against fortune and make sure our happiness was within our control. And Mill is going to say, if you think about a life that's truly spent just in pursuit of the lower pleasures, it's sort of a life from which the phenomena of addiction is made, where you're constantly a slave to your appetites. You need more food, more drink, more sex, right? You always need more of these immediate pleasures. But a life lived that's a life of liberty, a life of freedom, is one where we free ourselves from always having to serve those appetites, where we serve some sort of higher purpose. But Mill says the biggest reason why our happiness is tied up with having to pursue the higher pleasures is a sense of dignity. He says it's a sense of dignity all human beings have, and it is an essential part of the happiness of those in whom it is strong. That nothing which conflicts with it could be otherwise than momentarily an object of desire to them. Remember when he talked about the person who pursues wealth for its own sake, just hoards wealth? He explained this and says, look, pleasure is still their good. It's just that they can't imagine pleasure or happiness without wealth. Now, I think Mill thinks they're on the wrong track, but I think he's making a similar point here about pursuit of the higher pleasures. To someone who really owns up to what it means to be a human being, who really explores their human nature and all the pleasures it affords them, that sort of person will say, I can't imagine being happy in a lower grade of existence. Being able to pursue difficult tasks, to push myself, to challenge myself, and to feel the pleasure of accomplishment, that is simply something that I can't imagine my happiness not having. It's, again, a principal ingredient of my happiness. And what does Mill call this? It's a sense of dignity. The idea that a human being has a certain sort of dignity, a certain sort of life that we ought to live, and someone like Porky, who would spend their human life that they've been granted just rolling around the pigsty, it's something they simply are lacking or have maybe forgotten. But in any case, if that sense of dignity means that we cannot be happy without pursuit of the higher pleasures, then nothing Mill says about hedonism implies that we should live any sort of just immediate pleasure-seeking life. Nothing about hedonism, in his view, ultimately degrades human nature. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you as always for listening, and I will see you in the next video.